So welcome to Shiv, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Paul. Give me 1 minute while I switch things over so that we can get through here. And okay, hello everybody, and welcome. And most importantly, thank you to the FIAP Academy, the members of the board who are present here today. Also, a big thank you to PSA for actually giving me this opportunity to be introduced to FIAP so that I can present. So a big appreciation on my behalf to both organizations for giving me this opportunity. Before I start, I just want to mention a couple of things. This is not, I've got a little bug here. This is not a presentation where you're going to see hundreds of pretty pictures. This presentation is really designed to give you an opportunity to understand mirrorless cameras, their capabilities, and what more they can do than your typical DSLR. We've all had the pleasure of using various forms of medium, from film to the DSLR digital world, and now to the mirrorless world. Bear in mind that the mirrorless world is not really new. It really came into being somewhere in the 2010, 2009, that kind of time frame, but really gained popularity closer to 2011. And then by 2012, there was considerable recognition that this was a product that we would have to contend with. And I was fortunate enough, doing a lot of workshops. I got invited to look at various products and cameras. And when I started writing my book on time-lapse photography, I got a call from Panasonic saying, do you know that we can do time-lapse in camera? And I said, no, I didn't. They said, well, let me send you a Panasonic camera that is capable of doing time-lapse. And so I received what was then known as the Panasonic GH3. And quite to my surprise, I took a liking to it. It was small, very light. I had a decent complement of lenses. The longest lens was 600 millimeters as far as focal length is concerned, based on the equivalence. But it got me hooked. So let me just start my presentation and add a few more things to what I've just said. And we're going to talk about, transitioning to mirrorless and how that can really help you. But before we go there, let me show you a short video that was the convincer for me in 2014 to say a decent goodbye to all my Canon equipment. And fortunately, at the time, when you're in that early stage of technology advancement, the product that you have still has decent value. So I was able to recoup most of my cost. And, fortunately, that helped me move into this mirrorless world without feeling any financial pain, because I actually started with 4 complete systems. So with that, let me just start the Now, I hope this works over here. We switch things around a little bit, and give me 1 second. So that was photographed using a Panasonic GH4, which is the next generation after the GH3, the camera that I was using. And just the fact that something that's so small and so compact and designed to be a photographer's camera could capture video of that quality and that extent. Unfortunately, the whole Zoom system, the Zoom programs don't allow for high resolution video to be broadcast because of bandwidth. But that was a 4K clip, which you were seeing in 720p. So unfortunately, the resolution really wasn't as high of a quality as it actually is. But, you know, thinking about what I went through, and my real big concerns were, what's the image quality going to be like? Yeah, I agree that size and weight is, okay, it's going to be, but does this size and weight issue impact the kind of imagery that I want to do? But, overcoming all of that, I did enter the mirrorless world, and I said, I'm going to give it a try. And it was kind of interesting that having spent about 4 to 5 months with the mirrorless cameras, I was convinced that there was something definitely here, but I still wasn't convinced as to which particular camera I should be looking at, which one, was going to be a product that I was going to finally settle in on. So one fine afternoon, I, sort of collected everything that I had in the bank and went over to Hunt's Photo here in Melrose, and spoke to Gary, and I said, I want to buy 4 mirrorless camera systems, and I want you to accept this offer that I will return 1, I'll keep 3. So I bought the Panasonic system with the GH4. I bought the Olympus OMD EM1. Both were micro four thirds cameras. I was still not comfortable of micro four thirds, so I bought a Sony A7R, which was a full frame camera, and a Fuji XT, I believe it was then the XT1, if I'm not mistaken. The reason why I don't recall the Fuji so much is because that's the system I did return, and I kept the other 3. But really, as I transitioned, I started feeling more and more the capabilities of Panasonic. I wasn't an ambassador, I wasn't anything. I just started using the camera. I loved the feel. I loved the way its video capabilities were. But more importantly, I found that the lens selection was absolutely incredible. And there was another little bit of, convincing. When I started my photography, I was using Leica cameras, and to have realized that there was a Leica association with Panasonic, particularly in the design and development of the Panasonic Leica lenses, just sort of convinced me that I don't think I've made a mistake, and it's time to move on and really move into this world of photography. So just very briefly, if you look at the image on the left-hand side, it's really what the DSLR is all about. Lenses, mirrors, pentaprisms, sensors for the photography, sensors for the autofocusing system. And all of a sudden, you've got a lot of gear in there, which we all know was basically leftovers from the film days where you actually needed something like this. But there was really no reason for all of this type of gimmickry to be in a DSLR, which was, an electronic sensor. So the mirrorless world comes into play where they get rid of the pentaprisms, they get rid of the sensors, second sensor for focusing, and everything is managed by a single sensor, feeding that information into either a rear LCD screen or into an electronic viewfinder. Now, when you do that, you actually shrink the amount of space that is what was referred to as flange distance. So the distance from where your lens is mounted to where the sensor is. Now, by compressing that distance, something else happened. you couldn't use any of your DSLR lenses because they required that additional amount of space to focus onto the sensor the way it was positioned. And so those lenses basically became useless, but not completely useless, because you can bridge that gap or that distance with adapters. And all of a sudden, the adapter market became huge, and you could use all of your legacy lenses. But not only could you use all your legacy lenses, now you could use lenses from other manufacturers on your camera, because the adapter would fit various form factors. So you could put Nikon lenses on cameras that are designed for, Canon mounts, and Panasonic mounts were accepting everything from old Leica lenses to Nikon lenses to Minolta lenses, and legacy lenses gained another huge benefit. Because these mirrorless cameras were designed unlike the DSLR, where there was image stability built into the sensor mechanism, compared to DSLRs where all the image stabilization was done in lens, all your legacy lenses that were never designed to be image stabilized now all of a sudden have become image stabilized lenses on these cameras. So that it was enough to really say, okay, move on, let's maximize what we're doing with these cameras, and there should be no further concerns. But yes, there were some concerns. Will the quality be good? Will the quality be that good? And there was always a question, if you recall, when we went from film to digital, everybody said that analog look doesn't exist anymore. We've got the film to digital translation is no good. And yes, initially that was the issue, but over time, we overcame all of that. And that was not any problem at all. In fact, the resolution today is so high that if you even tried, you couldn't achieve that kind of resolution with any film. I mean, even if you take, large format film and then rescan it and shrink it down to fit 35 millimeters, you're not going to get the kind of resolution quality that you can directly from these cameras. So the onset basically was, sensor sizes, full frame with Sony, Leica, Panasonic, Canon, Nikon, and then the APS-C form factor, micro four thirds, which basically was only Panasonic and Lumix, Panasonic with Lumix and Olympus with the OMD cameras. And then there was a whole series of, we want to be big and we want to have larger sensors. And then you had Leica, Fuji, Hasselblad in phase one. But there is still a consideration that you have to look at. If you look at that outer box, that's really what medium format film was all about. And now you look at medium format in the digital world, the largest medium format sensor is the phase one sensor, which is considerably smaller than your medium format film. So it's a bit of a misnomer to say that these are medium format. They are larger than 35 millimeter, but they are definitely much smaller than the original medium format. And, stepping down from there, you also came up with some new formats like the Fuji G. But for all intents and purposes, it was nice to see that the mirrorless world retained the 35 millimeter form factor of 36 by 24, and then the typical APS-C, which both Canon and Nikon have, but with a slight difference, and then the micro four thirds. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the 1-inch type sensors and the smartphone sensors, because they're also all digital. They're also all mirrorless. But for purposes of our kind of photography, we'll exclude those from this presentation. So if you look at what there is out there in the medium format world, you've got cameras that range from $55,000 at 151 megapixels all the way down to a reasonably priced Fuji GFX 50R, which is about $4,500. And the fact is that when you were looking at medium format, it was really the camera for studio work. Portrait photography, product excuse me, product photography and also photography that required some, large printing capabilities. So yes, there were landscape photographers who also have been using these cameras, but the affordability has really come into play with the new Fuji cameras, which are sub $6,000 and really worth it. The Hasselblad XD1 is about $5,600, another very, very good camera. The interesting thing about the Hasselblad series of cameras is that they share the lens technology with Fuji, whereas Leica and Panasonic share lens technology. Hasselblad has, in fact, come up with some of their design renditions that have been absorbed by Fuji and vice versa. But if you really think about it, you have the capability of, on sensor, achieving 151 megapixels. Or if you look at the Hasselblad H6, which generates 400 megapixels, but it's using a 100 megapixel sensor. And the rationale of achieving that is what's known as sensor shifting, which is typically a very commonplace feature now available in many, many different mirrorless cameras, and we'll discuss that in a moment. As far as full frame is concerned, we're looking at sub $6,000 for most of the products, with the exception of the new Sony A1, which in my opinion is one of the most groundbreaking cameras ever. Capabilities of 30 frames a second, continuous burst shooting, with a 50 megapixel sensor. Their A7R4, which is the big brother of the Sony family of A series cameras, has a 61 megapixel sensor. But the Sony A1 is probably for the first time, you've got a camera that is competing head-on with any kind of sports photography camera that has been available out there. You're talking about high-end, the D series of Canon and the high-end Nikons that were, sports photographers' dream cameras. Now the Sony A1 far outdoes those capabilities without any issue whatsoever. You have Leica and you have Nikon, and then you have Lumix. These are your top full-frame mirrorless bodies out there, and you have various price ranges. As far as advantages of one over the other, there used to be the advantage of full and true hybrid capabilities, where cameras were shooting 4K video as well as doing high-resolution still photography, and the ability to intermix or to use video to capture stills and to have stills become video, i.e. in the time-lapse world. You also have Sigma and Zeiss. They also have full-frame mirrorless cameras. Just as an example, the L-Mount Alliance, which is the Leica SL series and the Leica S1R product line, in combination with Panasonic and Sigma, where the lens mount has been now made as a universal L mount. So everybody is making lenses for each other, which does make a big difference based upon how much money you want to spend. So now, if you're looking to buy a Leica body, an L mount body, you can use Sigma lenses without having to spend $7,000 on probably the cheapest large zoom Leica lens that's available out there. As far as APS-C is concerned, Sony has some wonderful cameras. They're tiny. The Fuji X-T4 is a great camera. And you're looking at, a Sony 6400, which is a great video camera also, sub $1,000. So, and today, from a price point of view, the euro and the dollar are pretty much equivalent. So you are looking at price points that are very, very reasonable. And then we get into the Micro Four Thirds world with, both Olympus and Panasonic. Olympus, as you are probably aware, has been acquired by a Japanese company, which is not Olympus. They are called OMD as the company, but they will continue to make the product line. at least hopefully for the near future, because it's good that Panasonic has that competition, because without competition, the product line does typically tend to die. So that's what we're looking at as far as camera bodies are concerned and price points with some of the feature functionality. Now, the differentiation between cameras has really come down to how well does it do video and how high resolution of video does it do. So the Sony A1 and the Canon R5 both do 8K video. Most of the others will do 6K, and the majority will do 4K. So then the next question comes up is, well, how slow can you make your video? So can you do 60p? Can you do 120p? Can you do 240p? And that's the kind of discussion that has been going on to rationalize which camera one should buy and which one should not. So with that, what I want to just mention to you is that I know that a lot of you who are in the European world or internationally down Far East or whatever may not be able to avail of this because of potential customs and other duties. But Panasonic cameras at Hunts Photo and Video will be available for the next 1 week at a 20% discount for everything, cameras, lenses, you name it. If you contact, and you can take a screenshot of this, Noah Buchanan at Hunts Photo, and just mention Shiv 20, and you'll get any product. He will give you a discount without any questions, and you can save a lot. Now, the difference between getting that discount and potentially the VAT or duty that you would be paying to import the camera in may be an offset, may not be an offset, but that's a decision I'll let you make. But the discount is available for you. All right, so sensor size impact, what really happens with sensor sizes? And this is not really just a mirrorless issue, but it was an issue even before mirrorless came into play. The larger the sensor, the less depth of field you will have for the same equivalence, and thereby more bokeh in your rendition of whatever it is that you're photographing, all things being equivalent. So really, if you think about it, and if your style of photography is, I'm going to throw out an example. If you are doing a lot of close-up work, a lot of macro work, then you're looking for more depth of field. So your obvious choice would be to go towards a camera that has a smaller sensor, thereby giving you greater depth of field, and also where you're, as an example, a 45mm macro lens on a micro four thirds camera is a 90mm equivalent, and that gives you the kind of equivalence that you are seeing for a 1:1 ratio to do macro. But you're actually doubling or more than doubling your depth of field. So based upon what your style of photography is, based upon what you like to capture and how you want, not that you can't achieve bokeh by adjusting your position relative to where your subject is. Yes, a lot of that can work. But if you really want to get into the nitty-gritties of it, that incremental depth of field or a decremented depth of field is really sensor dependent or sensor size dependent. As far as image quality is concerned, if you look at the Sony a7R IV today in the full frame world, and I'm going to just reference full frame as the primary subject of discussion with micro four thirds, is because not a lot of us are really going to expend our resources in buying medium format cameras, because they have a niche place to themselves. And for those of you who would like to, just factor in the difference between, or what I call in opposition to. So if you have a 35mm equivalent in micro four thirds, you're doubling your focal length. Or if you're using a APS-C, your 1.5 factoring or 1.6 factoring, as far as medium format is concerned, based upon the size of the sensor of which camera it is, you're looking at a 100mm lens becoming something like a 70 or a 75mm lens. So those equivalences need to be taken into consideration. But 61 megapixels, huge. The original A7R4 that I first bought had a 36.4 megapixel camera. And I was kind of surprised because I'd never seen that kind of resolution in anything prior to that. I mean, I never did own a Canon 5D SR, which was a 50 megapixel camera. I was using a 5D Mark IV, which didn't have a sensor that had this kind of resolution. So to me, this was like amazing. And that kind of depth was absolutely phenomenal. And then if you do what's known as pixel shift, where the sensor is actually moved either a quarter or a half pixel in all directions to either give you a 16 image capture or an 8 image capture, you're getting 240 megapixels worth of image data. On the Panasonic S1R, it's an 8 image shift and you get a 187 megapixel file, which is amazing. I mean, the fact is that today, if you can yield that kind of output, there's just an amazing amount of work that you can do. But think about something else. If you have that much resolution, look how much more you can crop into the image and still get a very, very decent rendition of what it is that you are capturing. So, you know, the Micro Four Thirds camera, everybody kind of said, yeah, but Micro Four Thirds too small, too small, too small. So I said, all right, let me do some experimentation for myself. So I took a camera, which is the Panasonic LX100, the original 100. A nice camera because, by the way, it's one of the few cameras that has the shutter built into the lens, so you can use some very high-speed flash sync capabilities. But this image was a 12 megapixel image, all right, that I had captured. But I had to crop it in because it was not perfectly well full frame captured, okay? So I had a lot of spare space on top. So this resulted in taking about 2/3 of the original image. And that gave me a resulting file of 7.8 megapixels. Now remember the Canon 1D when it came out, I believe that was something like a 10 megapixel camera, but this is 7.8 megapixels. So I took that image and I resized it to 5 feet or 60 inches by 90 inches at 240 pixels per inch so that it was fully printable. Okay, so now I have an image that is 5 feet by 7.5 feet in size. And I said, let's see how much detail this image actually has. So this is a 5 by 7 crop from that, which gave me a 2148 by 3009 pixel image. And you can see the detail of both the scarf that she was wearing, the finite detail of the hair, the eyelashes, and even the blood vessels in the eye. So when you can get this kind of resolution from a 12 megapixel camera, just validate for yourself how much you could do with one of these pixel shifted images, or even if non-pixel shifted, what can you do with anything that goes 50 megapixels and or higher? It's just unbelievable. It's absolutely phenomenal as to what you can extract from these cameras. All right, as far as color, that was another thing. You probably heard a lot of talk about color science and, who has good color science and who has terrible color science. The basic thing that we're dealing with over here is every manufacturer has their own nuances as far as color science is concerned. If you were, like a lot of us, shooters who used Velvia as our film of choice, we expected richness of reds and greens and all of that. I mean, that was given, all right? If you're shooting Velvia, you're going to have all of that. So now you go into the digital world and you're not going to get that kind of color intensity. Fuji today still can produce images that resemble Velvia, but it's not true Velvia. They can produce images that render like Provia, but it isn't true Provia. So visually, you get all of this, feeling about not being the right color, not being effective, not being this, not being that. Raw files are basically data files. You can manipulate the raw file to produce any kind of color rendition that you want if you are willing to spend a little bit of time with raw development software. If you're not willing to spend time, then you can buy, lookup tables and just apply lookup tables like we do for film and get the kind of colors that you expect. But where the flaws were coming up with color is in skin tone reproduction and color gradation. And that's where, the digital cameras of the 2013, 2014 timeframe had a little bit of gradation lacking. There wasn't that smooth transition. So if you had, blue skies, which went from, a little darker blue to a little lighter blue on one side, similar to what might happen if you were to use a polarizer, you'd get some distinct defined areas, not a smooth gradation. That has now been completely resolved. And as you can see in some of these images that I'll show you, that the skin tonality is so beautifully managed that one couldn't expect this from digital coming out of non-mirrorless cameras, because the technology just never went all the way there like it has done now. Okay, so how are we achieving this richer gradation? It's really using the sensor properties and the amount of dynamic range that is now available with the mirrorless cameras. The sensor coatings that are so beautifully worked into your sensor top that things like ghosting, flaring, all basically eliminated or grossly diminished. The color expression, again, as I said, if you want to shoot things in RAW, basically, or log, or what's known as hybrid log gamma, you can do that and attain any kind of color expression that you're looking for. It doesn't preclude you from doing that. Think about, rendering, and this is not using any kind of artificial light, not using any flash, extremely bright backgrounds, but yet skin tone qualities in a differentiation of a very fair person and an olive skin person, perfectly distinguished with no muddiness being applied to the sensor. Here again, extremely bright, but look at the skin tonality. It is dead on without any issue whatsoever. So with the wider dynamic range, if you look at the image on the left, that is the kind of dynamic range gradation representation that used to happen. Now you look at the one on the right, you will see fine detail. And again, my apologies, 720p on your screens may not look as good as it should, but you can at least see the definition or the difference in the rendering of all the detail, particularly if you look at the area of the sky, and the fact that with this dynamic range capability, the sensitivity of the sensor is so much more finite that overexposure, as long as you are within, I call the histogram parameters, that a little bit of creeping up on a raw file is fully recoverable and you will not have overexposure loss. The anti-reflective coatings, look at the image on the left, that's what we used to see before. All the ghosting and flaring basically are now suppressed because we're applying coatings on top of the sensor to incrementally reduce the kind of artifacts that used to happen prior to these technologies. All right, so high precision multi-process noise reduction. What does that really mean? Okay. As our ISO goes up, yes, we know that noise goes up. As noise goes up, we also know that the more time you have with your sensor remaining open or gathering light, it generates heat and heat generates more noise. But somewhere you've got to start managing and controlling that. And now we have feature functionality that allows us to do that. Here's an image. If you look at this image, it's near black. And all you're seeing is the backlight as a rim lighting. You can see fine detail in the lioness's head. You can see fine detail in where the ears are. All the hair detail is all there. But fundamentally, the image is black with an outline of light. One would normally see this image with a ton of discoloration because of sensor noise. Today, all of that is suppressed, even at high ISOs. And I'll tell you how we achieve that, okay? As far as balancing out, here's what was happening in the past. When you suppress noise, like when we had the GH5 in comparison to the G9 that is there now, you can see that the noise and sharpness were kind of complementary. And as you reduce noise, you also reduce sharpness or detail. Now you can take noise away and not have any sharpness or detail be damaged, let's put it that way. So here's a close-up of that, and you can see what happens in the hair. You can see that the hair noise detail has to some extent been reduced, but you've lost the sharpness of the hair in that area. This is the same image as you saw in the prior shot. This is the one on the right. You can see that there's absolutely no loss of detail. So what's really going on with this and how are we achieving this? So cameras now have what's known as dual native ISO. So you have your base ISO. We always talk about, Canon base ISO 100, Nikon base ISO 200. Panasonic used to have base ISO of 200. But now we're looking at ISOs in pairs. So the pairs of ISO are such that when you start seeing degradation of detail, then you switch the sensor from one amplifier to another amplifier. So the sensor starts behaving as a brand new sensor. So here's an example of native ISO 400 and the next native ISO of 3200. Two amplifiers enhancing the amplification on the same sensor by using two different circuits. So if you look at ISO 100, where your camera's native ISO now is ISO 400, you'll find that the yellow band, not the dark yellow band, but the light yellow band, is really two stops of dynamic range in the highlights, and the rest of the dynamic range is in the shadows or in the midtones and shadows. As you go in further and further in at ISO 1000, you will see that your dynamic range of highlights has increased considerably, and the dynamic range of the midtones and shadows has remained about the same, if not lower. But now you go to native ISO 3200, you're actually starting a brand new amplification at 3200. So the region between 1250 and 3200 is being managed by the second amplifier, but not in pushing up the amplification to gather more sensitivity, but maintaining a lower value to be able to increase the dynamic range. But notice how you start off all over again, but this time you start with only 2.3 stops of highlight dynamic range rather than just the 2 stops at native ISO 400. But when you start this new amplification, unlike what you might have had to do to go from 100 all the way up to, back in those days, 6400 used to be way too much. I mean, you'd lose your image. Now you can go to 25,600 ISO without any problem. And the real noise really starts coming in at about ISO 10,000 plus or 20,000 plus. You're still getting usable images, but yeah, the noise is a fair amount. All right, image stabilization, the importance of that. So DSLRs, most of them had image stabilization, which was lens-based image stabilization, because there was no way for them to actually move the sensor and manage the mirror and all of that mechanical stuff inside the body of the camera. With mirrorless, sensor-based stabilization became the norm. And so where the lens typically was doing 2 or 3 axis stabilization, with the sensor stabilization coming into play, you started getting 4 and 5 axis stabilization. And now you combine the two, where lenses are stabilized and your sensor is stabilized, and all of a sudden you are now looking at stabilization of 6 to 7 stops without any problem. So you're getting from your original lens stabilization to in-body image stabilization a gain of 3 to 4 stops just by being able to do dual stabilization. And how are they achieving that? Basically, a little bit of technology over here. You've got gyro sensors, you've got accelerometers, and you've got motion vector sensors, and all these are coming into play so that whether you're panning or you are, basically just jerking your camera around or whatever it is, the ability for these sensors to read what's going on at the rate of, 1 analysis per 1 millisecond, it is fast enough to stabilize your entire system to the extent that you never could believe was achievable before. And it really shows up not so much in still photography, but it shows up a lot in video. And that's where you realize the benefits of this kind of stabilization. So this is the quick example of, again, I'm using the 2 cameras that I possess, the GH5, which is the older camera, the G9, which is now also pretty old. But just going from one camera to the other to gain, a stop and a half was huge. So with dual IS, the equivalence, because you've got to remember that when you are looking at image stabilization, you also got to look at the focal length of the lens that you're using, because the longer the focal length, the more stabilization you need for it to manage the same amount of movement based upon where your subject is. So if you look at the equivalence basis on a Micro Four Thirds camera, a 140 millimeter lens really behaves like a 280 millimeter lens because you're doubling everything. And this is the kind of improvement that you can get. So with that, okay, and I'd mentioned this earlier, legacy lenses, okay, some of the most beautiful lenses out there, which otherwise you might have decided to throw away. Now you can buy adapters and use those adapters to mount these lenses onto your mirrorless camera. Now remember one thing, that if you have a Micro Four Thirds mirrorless camera, which has a 4/3 sensor, which is basically a quarter the size of a 35 millimeter sensor, and you put a full frame lens, let's say you have a Leica full frame lens or a Minolta full frame lens or even a Canon full frame lens, and you mount that lens using an adapter on your Micro Four Thirds camera, you're never going to use the outer edges of your lens. You're only going to use the sweet spot of your lens, the central portion. And because you're going to use the central portion, the edge distortion, any kind of chromatics or any kind of edge distortion that would typically take place if that lens were mounted to a full frame camera completely goes away. But by no means can you not use that lens on your full frame camera, just that the aberrations that existed will still show up in a full frame format. But if you can use that on an APS-C or in a Micro Four Thirds camera, then you basically eliminate all of the peripheral problems that those lenses had. Now, you can get adapters that are full communication adapters. You can get adapters that only allow you to do certain things. And then you can get adapters that are totally dummy. They just act like spacers between the camera and the lens to allow you to use your lens. If you're getting a dummy adapter, then make sure that the old lens that you have at least has mechanical aperture control. All of them typically back in those days had manual focus. So as long as it has manual aperture control, you're going to be able to use it on any of these cameras without any problem. Just as an example, you can get adapters from a company called Photodiox, there's a whole Novaflex, et cetera. There are some adapters which actually give you a mechanical aperture capability, so that if for whatever reason your lens was not a manual aperture lens and the lens remains fully open, wide open, then you can use an adapter's aperture control ring to manage your aperture and thereby your exposure. Metabones, well known for their autofocus capabilities. These will not only control aperture and focus, but they will also give you full EXIF information. That's the information that the lens sends back to the camera that gets written into the file, so that when you are processing the file, it knows what lens you used, it knows, what the aperture was, etc. So if there are any lens corrections that need to be made incrementally after you have captured the image, then your Lightroom or your, whatever raw processing software is, will be able to recognize what lens was used, and thereby will be able to perform those corrections that otherwise would not have happened. But there's something else that can be done with these lenses, with these adapters. And these adapters have optics built into them. And the optics that are built into these give you the ability to get one incremental f-stop of light into your camera. So it's not a full frame to full frame equivalence. You won't necessarily get it there. But yes, you will get it when you're using it on the Micro Four Thirds camera. And these are called speed boosters. So an f2.8 lens, an f2.8 manual lens, or even an f2.8 Canon lens that has autofocusing capability will now behave like an f2 lens, or a f4 lens will behave like a 2.8 lens, giving you that kind of light and giving you that kind of bokeh if that's what you're looking for. So you can't use it on full frame cameras, but you can use it on any cameras that are with a smaller sensor size. All right, we want to talk about high resolution mode, but what I would like to do at this point is I just want to check with the control room over there to see if there are any questions or anything that need to be responded to right away.
There is one that has come in already, Shiv. It's wondering, are mirrorless cameras more susceptible to dust than the DSLRs? And Liam, who sent this in, is thinking here about the smaller flange size and less protection for the shutter and the sensor provided by the mirror mechanism.
The answer to that was going to be, oh, yes. But now it's a little different answer. So remember one thing, that your digital SLR had a mirror in front of the sensor, and the mirror acted like a little protection, preventing dust from getting to the sensor easily. Not that it didn't get to the sensor, it did get to the sensor, but not as easily as with mirrorless cameras, because the mirrorless camera sensor is completely open. As soon as you take the lens off, you can see the sensor. You don't have to do any mirror lockup to clean it. It's right there staring at you in the face. So yes, there was a fair amount of sensor dust collection. But the sensor dust collection is also attributable to the electrostatics, or the electrostatic charge that behaves like a dust attractor. So we always recommended that, if you're going to be changing lenses, make sure that you change it in a clean environment. Before you put your new lens on, use a blower, blow away the sensor so that if there is any dust, you're going to get rid of it. Fortunately, now with the introduction of a kind of a cover, the mechanical shutter, which otherwise in a camera remains open all the time till you're about ready to take the picture, when it closes and reopens again, unless you're using electronic first curtain shutter, the shutter now closes when you remove the lens. So when you remove the lens, the shutter will close, thereby there is far less exposure to dust and thereby less dust collecting on the sensor. I hope that answers your question.
And just to remind people here for the presentation that if you have any questions for Shiv, just please send them to me by the chat facility and I can pass them on. Okay, that's it for the moment, Shiv. So
all right,
go back to the presentation. Yep.
Super. So high resolution mode. Let's take an example of what happens in a camera that I use, which is the Panasonic Lumix S1R. It's a full frame camera, 48 megapixels in normal mode. But what it does is that it can capture high resolution images using pixel shift technology. Now, what is pixel shift technology? What really happens is that when you are using a high resolution image, the sensor shifts by either half or a quarter pixel to the left, to the right, up and down. And all those images then get combined in camera to produce one high resolution image. The way it does that is it uses the camera's internal image stabilization system to shift that sensor around. Because remember, the image stabilization is being stabilized. The stabilization is happening because the sensor is moving in conjunction, in opposition to the movement that the camera is sensing. So when the camera senses left, the sensor moves right, and so on. But if you were to turn off image stabilization and use that technology to be able to shift the sensor by half or by a pixel or whatever you do, you can now start creating much higher resolution images. And those images get combined in camera. Now, what else happens? And this is where, people sometimes will say, well, what's the point of a high resolution image if I don't really need that resolution? Yes, I completely agree. If you don't need that resolution, don't shoot high res. But something else is really, really beautiful when you shoot high res. Remember, the sensor of your camera has a Bayer pattern. 2 greens, 1 red, 1 blue for every pixel area. So when you take that shot, the green captures green, the blue captures blue, the red captures red. But now when you do sensor shifting, the blue captures blue, then captures red, then captures green, and so on for every sensor spot that is typically otherwise only one color. So now with a higher resolution image, not only are you getting a higher resolution file, but you're getting a much higher resolution color rendition, or let's put it this way, a much better color rendition and a much better color gradation as far as the image is concerned. Does the camera have to be on a tripod to capture high resolution images? Yes, because it is relying on moving the sensor. So if the camera also was moving, then you would obliterate the effect that was being caused. But new modes are being developed where the camera will accept handheld shots. You will still be able to produce pretty good high resolution images, and those images do get combined into very usable images. What you have to watch out for when you're creating high resolution images is if there is physically a lot of movement in your image. So if there is a very strong breeze and all the trees and all the leaves are moving, then yes, the camera is going to have a very hard time capturing a good rendition. But there are algorithms now in the camera that says between 0.1 of the high-res image to 0.2 to 0.3, what shifted? And if it shifted, and if it is going to make the image look blurry, then for that area that is looking blurry or tending to get blurry, the camera eliminates the high resolution and captures the sharpest or retains the sharpest resolution portion of that frame to create the final image. So that technology has progressed considerably. And as you can see here, the left-hand side image is a high resolution crop of the same image that was in standard resolution. Not only will you see a color differentiation, but you can see the amount of detail. Again, my apologies, 720p doesn't quite cut it, but if you do this yourself, you will see that the differences are huge, and it becomes even more exaggerated as you enlarge the image further and further. Okay, next one. We were talking about the capabilities of these cameras and their focusing systems. Everybody said no good focusing. The cameras are pretty useless. The focusing is very slow. The digital camera as a DSLR was very nice. I mean, you know, Nikon had some tremendous focusing capability, as well as Canon. But remember, they were all focusing using a dedicated focusing sensor. Now focusing is being done directly on the main sensor or by the main sensor. So a lot of things have changed. The ability for the algorithms to analyze what the camera is actually seeing, to be able to interpret it, and then to be able to create that as a captive focus point is just completely unbelievable. I mean, the more this has evolved, the more one realizes what technology can do. And by all means, I mean, don't take my word for it, read what the articles say. I mean, between what Sony and Canon have done, it's mind-boggling as to the capabilities of those cameras. Tracking, the ability to point to a subject's eye and have the camera track that eye for the entire duration of your capturing it, and to be able to have that eye disappear if the head turns and then reappear, and in continuum to be able to take multiple images without losing focus is something that we never could do before. And before, we were talking about cameras that had capabilities of, 6 frames, 7 frames a second. And the moment you turned autofocus continuous on, or AI servo, as it used to be called in Canon terminology, you'd start missing shots, and the camera would in fact slow down. And if the buffer filled up, the camera would slow down even more. But now you can take 60, 70, 80 images in continuous bursts without losing focus. And I think that kind of technology is just to be sort of really truly appreciated. Now, we move from 1 area, 2 area, 7 area to 225 area multi-focus points. That was then something that went way beyond what any DSLR could do. The ability to tune your focusing to the areas that were most important, so that you focused on, let's say, if you were taking something that is moving, across the screen, you could change your focus to being, a series of dots that went across the screen horizontally, or if you were doing vertical. The zone autofocusing capabilities. Then there came the next point where you could actually toggle your focus by using a joystick and move it around the frame. The ability to have focus points the entire frame size, not limited to the central area. And then finally, to be able to have computers within your camera do recognition with, where is the subject? Can it be predictable? And looking at the depth from defocus technology that Panasonic came out with, all of that starts playing a role of making your focusing faster and faster and faster. And not only is it going to get better and better, but the ability to do tracking for human eyes, animal eyes, bird eyes, and in real time. No more do you need what used to be, the lock-on autofocus areas. Now the camera says, I see an eye, do you want it? Yep, click, and boom, it'll track that eye as long as that eye is available anywhere on the screen. Even going now towards the very edge of the screen, it'll do real-time, fully isolated tracking of that subject's eye. And if the eye disappears, it'll go to the second eye. If that disappears, if your head turns, it will do predictive based upon the rotation of the head. The algorithm will say, where's this eye going to potentially appear? So it's ready for it and captures it when that eye reappears. And that kind of technology was unheard of before. New focus modes, point scope focusing, where you can literally get down and, where if you're familiar with the little crosshair type focusing, now point scoping, you can do that and have it blow it up for you automatically within camera to show you the focus from 3 to 10x without any problem. Auto switching, in the vertical, horizontal. Every single kind of focusing capability can be programmed now either in camera through your function buttons or on your lenses through function buttons that are available on your lenses. So all of that has just made life so much easier. Yes, you're using many more fingers to take pictures now than you ever did before, but it's so much more fun. You can customize your settings based upon the type of subject matter that you're shooting. You can change the sensitivity. You can change the object movement prediction, how fast you want it to move, how fast you want it to lose focus. So let's say you were tracking something and a tree comes in between you and the subject that you were tracking. The camera can say, all right, the subject was 10 feet away, the tree is 5 feet away. I'm going to stay at 10 feet because he's going to appear at the other side of the tree. That's predictive. It knows that's going to happen. But if you make that predictive not sticky, if you want it to rapidly change based upon what appears, then as soon as the subject goes behind the tree, the camera will focus on the tree because that's the closest focusable area that it finds. So these are all fully customizable, and you can change it to do whatever you want and how fast you want it or how slow you want it. Very quickly on manual focus, if you are a manual focus person, even with legacy lenses, this helps based upon how it's connected to the camera. As soon as you turn your focusing ring, you can tell the camera to do something with it. Either blow it up entirely on the screen so you can see the close-up view of what you're focusing on, or to do it as a picture-in-picture, and those are settable in camera. So do you want the assist on the focus ring? Do you want the focus ring and manual focus button? Or do you just want the manual focus button to do it? The variability of settings is just, no more are you limited to, I want my camera to do this, how do I make it do it? And you can just do it. Focus peaking, another great feature. Again, you see it on screen, you can see it in the viewfinder, you can see it on your back LCD screen, and you can display focus peaking with whatever color it is. So if you find that in this particular case, I've got a green background with some green foliage, and I have blue as my focus peaking. Well, it's not necessarily the best focus peaking color for this image, but I can change it. I can make it go red, or I can make it go yellow. I can make it go any color that I want. I got focus peaking on, it says yes, and then you want to change it. What do you want? Do you want it at a high level or a low level? And what display color do you want? And based upon whether you're set to high or low, the colors will accordingly go from this blue, orange, green to a red, yellow, blue. All right. So let's talk about how fast can you shoot? What is high-speed shooting? We're familiar with autofocus, single, pretty decent speeds, 12 frames a second. But now how about 60 frames a second? The ability to shoot 60 frames per second raw images, zero blackout. If you're not familiar with blackout, it's the fluttering that you see happen in your viewfinder when you are doing rapid bursts of photography. With autofocus continuous, you can now shoot at 20 frames a second. By the way, the Sony camera can now shoot at 30 frames a second. Okay. I have not updated this particular slide with that. You can customize your drive modes, which is again, drive mode 1 can be set to high speed burst. Drive mode 2 can be set to pre-burst. So I'm sure you're going to ask, what is pre-burst? We'll get to that in a second. So here's how you can assign it. You can set it to burst shot, high, medium, low, super high, super medium, or super high with pre, or super high 1 with pre. What both these pre modes use 6K and 4K photo modes, all right? Before, there used to be some issues with 6K, 4K because of noise reduction. All that has been taken care of, so you don't have to worry about it. The other issue with 6K and 4K photo modes were because 6K, 4K are video-centric, you were getting effects of rolling shutter, and that's where, you know, things start looking as though they're leaning forward. That has been taken care of because the rolling shutter effect has been taken away because the camera now uses predictive motion estimation.
Yeah, so type in that number. I'm so genius, aren't I? Okay.
Sorry, somebody's speaking. Okay. So with all of that technology, your mechanical shutter now is capable of going to 1/8,000th of a second without a problem. But we were getting about 1/4,000th of a second with the older cameras. But now with electronic shutters, you can achieve 1/32,000th of a second without any problem. But more importantly, you can shoot silent. And when I say shoot silent, it's completely silent to the point where it gets confusing. You don't know whether you've taken 1 shot or 100 shots because your finger was depressed. And at that high burst rates and at that high resolutions, you're filling up your cards very, very fast. And you're going to have to do a lot of culling out if you're not careful. So be cognizant of the fact that if you're using like a Sony A7 R4, 61 megapixels, and it'll give you a burst of 90 images, well, very soon you're going to be downloading 90 images that pretty much look the same. And you got to figure out how quickly you can get rid of them, because now your disks are going to start filling up. All right, there are some cons as far as these high-speed electronic shutters are concerned. And there's a little bit of banding. You get some what they call jelly distortion, particularly if you're in artificial light. High-speed electronic shutters do tend to give you banding because of the sync speed of the light that is in your area. So, 50 hertz will have a 50 hertz kind of problem. 60 hertz has a 60 hertz problem. But those are now being controlled and being managed with the newer shutters and getting better and better. However, flash sync speeds are still limited. And though a lot of cameras have been designed to turn flash capabilities off when you're in electronic shutter mode, the newer cameras do allow you to use the electronic shutter with the flash. But again, your flash sync speed is limited to about 1/200th of a second. With mechanical shutters, you can go 1/400th of a second. And if you have one of those in-camera shutters, then yes, you can go 1/8000th of a second. The 4K and 6K photo modes that I mentioned earlier, it's actually using the video capability or the high-speed video capability of the camera, but giving you the ability to use high shutter speeds, just as you would for your standard photography. Because remember, typically video is shot at twice the shutter speed of what you're going to play back at. So if you're in Europe and you're using PAL, your PAL shutter speed would be based upon a 24 frames a second, which means your shutter speed will be 1/50th of a second. In the US with NTSC, you're shooting 30 frames a second, playing back 30 frames a second, shooting it at 1/60th of a second. That's for video. But if you go into photo mode, your shutter speed can be 1/1000th of a second, 1/2000th of a second without any problem. So whereas in video, you're intentionally trying to create a little bit of motion blur to form continuity of video, with photography, you don't need motion blur. So you can go very high shutter speeds and record in either 6K, which will give you 18 megapixel files, or 4K, which will give you 8 megapixel files. The difference being with 6K, your burst rate is about 30 frames a second. With 4K, your burst rate is 60 frames a second. But in both cases, you get very, very usable images. So here's an example. I just want to show you what you can do with this high-speed burst mode. Observe the screen. So what that is a series of continuously taking images at 60 frames a second and then harvesting one image out of that. So all that transpired, and then I grabbed one image of this water drop as it hit the water and bounced back up. You can't do this unless you use high-speed type of photography. You'd have to use a flash. The flash would fire at its, lowest power, giving you the maximum speed, and your shutter of your camera would remain wide open, and you'd have to time it electronically so that when the water drop hits the water and starts coming up, it's synced to the flash fires, and you capture this image, and you have to be in a dark room, etc., etc. But now you don't. You can do this in standard light with normal, setups, and you can practice and get any kind of image you want, because what is your practice? Practice is only holding the shutter button down and letting the camera do the work. Post-focus, and I'll get to pre-focus in a minute, pre-burst in a minute. With post-focus, what you can do is take an image and then later on decide what you want to be in focus. A good example of that would be you're at a wedding and you're in the church and you're taking pictures, and there's 20 rows of people sitting there, and you take a picture of the members of the wedding party. And you realize that there was a very nice expression on the person in the 5th row on the left-hand side. Well, you can tap the person on the 5th row on the left-hand side and have that be in perfect focus, and the rest of the people in your image will be just nicely blurred out. So the way it works is that the camera actually also uses the video capability to do post-focus. And let me show you an example. Sorry, I'm going to just talk about pre-burst. My slides are a little bit out of order. This shot on the left and the shot on the right were taken with pre-burst. What is pre-burst? When you set your camera to do pre-burst and you focus on something, the way you focus is basically have to press the shutter. The camera is continuously taking images, filling up the buffer 30 frames, and then emptying out the buffer while it fills another 30 frames, and so on and so on and so on. And it does this in continuum. Since it's using the video capability of the camera, there is no endpoint, because there is no time when a standard camera wouldn't be able to continue to shoot for 60 frames a second in video mode. So it's capturing, emptying, capturing, emptying. And when you actually depress the shutter, it retains the previous 30 images and gives you the remaining additional 30 images after that. So when you see something take off from a perch and you press your shutter, 99% of the time, you're going to miss the shot. But here you never miss the shot because the camera has already taken 30 images before you press the shutter and another 30 after you press the shutter. So you now can harvest the right image taken at the decisive moment and have your image to your satisfaction. A hummingbird sticking its tongue out. I just had it on pre-burst. I knew it was going to do something. It had just been feeding. So I just kept my finger pressed on the shutter. And when I saw some movement, I just depressed the shutter, knowing fully well that I have 60 images to pick from to get the one I want. All right, so here's post-focus. Here's how it works. There are actually 5 objects on the screen which I'm going to take an image of. And it's at f2.8. And here's what the camera does. So it tells you that it's recording this image in post-focus mode. And job's done. So now I go in, and you can see the middle die has got the green around it saying focus peaking is active, and it's showing that that die is in perfect focus. I can go and tap anything on the screen, and now that will be in focus, and that will be in focus, and so on. So once I've decided that I want to keep one of those die in focus, I can actually do a focus peak and blow it up to make sure that it is in fact in focus. And then I can say, all right, I want to do either an auto merge or a range merge. I want that green-blue die to be in focus and that white die to be in focus. And once I've picked those, it says, do you want to merge it into a single picture? And you say yes. It creates it, and it gives you that image with those 2 in focus and everything else out of focus. So here's the final image. You can see the orange, 2 orange dyes are out of focus. The black dye is kind of out of focus, but the 2 that I tapped are in perfect focus. How can you use this to your advantage? Here's another example. You can do this kind of merging with either an auto merge where it'll take and merge all the images together. So like when you want to do a focus stack, you can do a focus stack now in camera and produce a focus stacked image. Unfortunately, so far the technology is only allowing you to do a focus stack in JPEGs. So if you want to do a focus stack with RAW, you have to use something else, and I'll show you that. But with post-focus merging, here's a picture of these lilies, and I have 2 ways of doing it. I can either take these lilies and show you the lilies in perfect focus with the background or without the background. So if I do a range merge, I can do a blurred background, same image, same series of images captured, or I can do an auto merge where everything is in focus like on the left. So that's nothing more than a postcard that I just put on a foam core background. And as you can see, the 2 lily images are exactly the same sharpness, but the background is different, but taken with the same set. It's exactly the same set of images. So with that, how do you do that kind of focusing for RAW files? So these mirrorless cameras now have multiple ways of bracketing. We're all familiar with focus bracketing, right? Where you can, exposure bracketing, where you can do up to 3 EV up, down, or take 3 shots, 7 shots, 5 shots, whatever, in increments of 1/3 to 1 EV setting. You get your single shot and you're done. Or you can do multiple shots and you can then later on combine those. The camera now also has aperture bracketing. It can do aperture bracketing, and you can vary your aperture from 1 to 2 to 3 or whatever you want, and it'll take multiple images at different aperture settings. And similarly, you can do white balance bracketing. But the most important is what I consider to be focus bracketing. With focus bracketing, you can set it to how many steps of focus do you want. That means what is the distance you want the lens to focus at from the first place to the second place, and it'll do that same step in continuum based upon the number of images you want it to capture. And you can set the sequence, like go from the closest to the furthest, or go from the furthest and come back to the closest. That's your choice. And once you do that, you can capture frames that this one is actually 46 images that were taken in focus bracket mode and combined into a single image. And this is using RAW files. So if you want that RAW file capability, you can do focus bracketing in camera. But if you want a quick understanding of some images that you want to take that are stacked for you, you can use post-focus and do the stacking accordingly in post-focus mode. So this is what was the thing that got me most excited about the mirrorless world, and that was time-lapse and stop motion. So you can do full time-lapse in camera, and then you have a choice. If you do full time-lapse and you want the camera to create your video for you, it'll do it, but it then uses JPEG images to create the video. But if you want RAW files and have full capability to manipulate those RAW files as you want, then you shoot in RAW mode and then work with a product like LR time-lapse in conjunction with Lightroom to combine those images into your time-lapse animated video. Or you can do stop motion animation, which is a lot of fun on a boring rainy day, where you can use onion skinning and use little cartoon figures and move them around your dining table and create all kinds of animated scenes with it. But all of that can be done now in camera. You don't need anything special to do it with. So here's an example of some ice cream melting as a time lapse, shot in camera, processed in camera, and delivered. So some vanilla ice cream with some food coloring, and there you have your image. But now notice something. The format is not like a video, right? I mean, this format is actual photographs, 4:3 aspect ratio. But if I was to do this for actually creating a video, I would shoot a little loose, and then I would crop it down into a 4:3 aspect ratio because there's enough data in the camera to allow me to do that. But not only does it then allow me to create a 16:9 aspect ratio video, but there's enough data for me to actually create incremental animation in post-processing to create any kind of movement, either left, right, top, down, whatever you want to do. Because you're only using a very small portion of the captured image in a HD format, even 4K format. So this is basically what the camera is doing. It's doing full video 4K, does a full pixel readout from the sensor, but then resizes it to give you 4K or full HD in 16:9. So you can see how much more room there is available on the sensor for you to be able to do any post animation if that's something that you want to do. So you don't have to necessarily pan your camera while doing a time lapse. You can just leave it stationary and then give the representation of a panned readout afterwards. All right, ISO and a low light performance. This was something that was, of interest to a lot of people when I was trying to tell them that I had moved, and they said, well, what do you do about, the terrible ISO of these cameras? And yes, there were some cameras that had some poor ISO performance, but this was taken in my living room, just as an image, just to demonstrate what it can do. And when we have ISO capability of, like the new Sony A7S has an ISO of, top ISO of 409,000, you can practically have these cameras see things in the dark, and that's absolutely true. But here's an example of a JPEG image shot at ISO 3200, just using standard exposure, JPEG on the left, RAW on the right. This gives you an idea of how much of a resolution issue you can start seeing between the two. And then if you do expose to the right, if you're familiar with exposing to the right, and you then process that file, you will see that your noise has in fact gone, because you're shooting not to the low end of the histogram spectrum where there is the least amount of data. You're shooting to the high end of the histogram spectrum where you're capturing literally 4 times, if not more, data that you can then manipulate to completely eliminate noise. And if you do noise reduction, you can see that when noise reduction is applied, there's absolutely no visibility of any kind of both color as well as luminescence noise. Which then took me to the next thing is, okay, if you can do all of this with these cameras, can you actually do time lapses to create a video of the aurora? And this was a video that was most interesting because you can't shoot a video of the aurora borealis. The reason you can't shoot a video of the aurora borealis, except with the newer cameras, is that you require 3200 ISO, and you require the shutter to be open for a minimum of 10 to 11 seconds. Well, you can't shoot video with a shutter speed of 10 to 11 seconds, so you can't capture video, period. Even if you up your ISO all the way up, you are still getting a shutter speed that is slower than the shutter speed capable of generating video. But if you can do the same thing in time-lapse animation, then you have an image video that is absolutely amazing. So one of the things that I just do want to mention about when you are doing any kind of focus stacking is don't get too concerned. This is a focus stacked image. And the fact that when you do a stack of 5 images, any motion in your image gets exaggerated and will start looking like you used an ND filter. Here, both the clouds and the ocean were, of course, moving, and a 5-image stack for a focus stack image will render the ocean and the sky as, you know, soft, flattened out objects. So I just want to take a short amount of time and just tell you what I use as far as my camera and lens choices are in the film frame world. And in the Micro Four Thirds world. My bodies are a G9 that I use for all my photography, and the GH5S that I use for video and for low light photography. The GH5S will go down to a very high ISO level and will shoot beautifully in low light conditions. I have three lenses that I carry typically: a 12 to 60 variable aperture f2.8 to f4, 818 2.8 f4, and then a 1025, which is a 1.7 lens. A 70 to 200 with the 2 tele extenders. That's a pro lens f2.8. The micro, so there's a little reverse, sorry about that, the S1 and the S5. And then the S series lenses are 1635, a 50 millimeter 1.4, and a 2470 2.8 with, you know, various other choices that I bring in and out as needed. With wildlife photography, I'm using the 100-400 as my standard lens that gives me a range of 200 to 800 millimeters. And I've never really felt the need for anything more. It's very light, it's very easy to carry. I use the lens as an f4.63. It does not take a tele extender. When I need faster speeds, I'm using the 200 millimeter f2.8, and I can then adapt it with the 1.4 or the ×2 tele extender. With the ×2 tele extender, this lens becomes an f5.6 at 800 millimeters compared to 6.3 with the 100-400. So for lower light, yes, this is a far superior lens. It's about 1.5 times the price of the 100-400, and it will not zoom. It is a prime lens, but it's an absolute exquisite lens. For portraits, I'll use a 42.5 Leica. It's the Leica Noctecron, which is a Panasonic Lumix Leica lens, f1.2. One of the sharpest lenses I've ever used in my life. In fact, it is as good, if not better, than the Sumiluxes and the Sumicrons that Leica makes. 15 millimeter Leica 1.7 for wide nighttime street photography. Lovely lens to use, great for time lapse. It has a fixed clickable aperture ring that is very advantageous for these types of nighttime photography, because you don't want to accidentally slip your aperture when you're doing any kind of night work. As far as supports are concerned, I use a product that I find to be most interesting. Let me just switch over to that. I use what's known as a Platypod, as a low-level device that I can mount any kind of a ball head on. I'm using a Rigetti ball head, which is a geared ball head. Basically, I can do any kind of tilting and forward, backward, level this up any way you want. It's just an exquisite product. And one of the things that I've found with this is that for product, landscape, and astrophotography, there's nothing to beat a geared head. If you have the opportunity, go to their website and look at it, and just be rest assured that it is one of the nicest pieces of gear that you can use for that type of work. The Platypod also comes as a little baby device, which is here. It's a smaller version, and this thing, both of them have spikes that you can use to position them any way you want, and you can just hook this onto your belt, strap it onto poles, take it to places where tripods are not allowed. No tripod police will tell you you can't use this because it's a tripod. It isn't. And so I tend to use this more and more wherever I go. As a part of the family of these products, there is a second product out there called the, where did I go? Sorry about that. Let me just go back to. So that's on the right-hand side is the Rigetti that I use. On the left-hand side is a brand new Platypod product called the Platyball. It's the first electronically controlled leveling device. The device has, if you can see it, let me just pull this one away. So this basically has no knobs, no dials, except the one to lock the top and to do the panning. The adjustment of this is you loosen by clicking this, and you tighten by clicking the top one. And it'll hold, we rate it to hold about 20, 22 pounds. It'll hold without any problem 40 pounds. We've kept 40 pounds on this for about 12 hours, and there hasn't been any movement whatsoever. It just locks on tight. The nice feature about this is if you want to do levels, you can level it even in the dark. So it has a little leveling system, which allows you to just look at the lights. If you can see the little arrows, you can move this and get it to level up for you exactly when you get the cross. And I'm looking at it at a very awkward angle, unfortunately, but when you get the two greens matching up horizontally together, then the product is perfectly level, and you can, it's upside down. So no matter what the angle of your tripod or how your tripod is aligned, you can basically pan the head and have it be perfectly level. Now, this is not available yet. It'll be available at the end of the year. But all the Platypod products are discounted. All you need to do is to go to www.platypod.com, and you can get a 15% discount on every product. That is, even the ones that are already discounted, you can take another 15% off the discounted product price. Okay, so let's just go back to. So with that, one of the things that I just also wanted to mention is that there are some other features that are kind of important to just briefly go over, and so that you can understand. I know we had said that we'd close this out in 2 hours, which we will do. In-camera panoramics, no problem at all. You can do full in-camera panoramics with some exceptional abilities. So this was captured in high resolution mode. Its end result is 40 feet by 5 feet. And this is something that I did when I first realized the cameras could do this. It was shot in 2016. That's what it looks like in its finished full final state. Live composite. Now, if you're not familiar with live composite, let me just briefly tell you that if you were to do star trails, you would have to take multiple images with digital cameras. That is not fun. But now, using live composite, you can do the same kind of thing that you were able to do with a film camera. So you turn the camera into live composite mode and turn it on and let it build. You can see the build on the LCD screen at the back, and you can stop it whenever you want. While you're doing this build, you can do any kind of light painting that you'd like to do, or anything else that you might be interested in doing in your creative spirit. The interesting thing about the way live view works is that with each exposure, it only captures the incremental light that it sees. So if it sees the same intensity of light in the same place, the camera does not capture that. If it sees new intensity in a different place, it'll capture that. And finally, the result is a fully captured star trail, or fully captured light trails, car trails, whatever you want to do in a city. All of that can be captured using live composite. Using dynamic range optimization and hybrid log gamma. Hybrid log gamma, unfortunately, you can only see if you have a 4K TV. Otherwise, right now, hybrid log gamma cannot be printed nor viewed on standard screens. And that's why you're seeing this image a little bit on the dark side. Dynamic range optimization is done also within camera, so you can capture brilliant amount of detail, both in the shadows and highlights in a single image without having to do HDR. And HDR looks really cartoonish. In-camera perspective control, so the need to buy tilt-shift lenses is no longer that important. The image on the left is what was captured. The image on the right uses perspective control from in-camera itself. And then lastly, but not only, video is what these cameras are, and gives them the hybrid capability where you can do both stills and video and combine them or do them at the same time. So cameras are capable of shooting continuous video. And while you're doing video, you can actually press the shutter and capture individual images. The option is Do you stop the video and take a capture, or you want to continue the video and take a capture? It'll allow you to do both. So what you saw in the beginning, that one image, was a still frame captured from within this video. So the other nice thing about the video capability is that you can do harvesting from within a video, or you can use your shutter speed to capture a single frame when you need it. Just another example of doing both a combined image stack and high dynamic range, but not HDR, dynamic range optimization, combined with focus stacking. And with that, I will now open it up.